What's up, everybody? So this is going to be one of those videos where there are just a lot of things to talk about. Most of them are not worth their own video, so I have no idea what I'm going to title this one yet. It might be something generic. I might try to focus on like the biggest bit of news and title it that. But I have a list of things that are worth discussing, so hopefully I can knock everything off this list. First off, a few people had mentioned the Bloomberg report that came out a few days ago and why I hadn't addressed it yet. It's very simple. That Bloomberg report is written by somebody that most Nintendo fans consider unreliable. As a matter of fact, a month or so ago, he released an article talking about how the Switch 2 sales were failing to ease game developers' gloom, like basically saying that the game sales were doing awful. Back when that article came out, everybody across the Nintendo sphere basically considered that this whole thing was just rage baity. Many of them even referred to the author as a grifter, because of course that's the response generally that Nintendo fans have to criticism. And it was swept very quickly under the rug. I know on Reddit, for example, they immediately had removed the post. They wouldn't even let it stay on there. But now that he's saying that they're upping the production of the Switch 2 units, now all of a sudden he's reliable. He's also the same person that had convinced everybody that the Switch 2 would sell 6 to 8 million units on launch with his same article. And as we all know, the Switch 2 did not sell 6 to 8 million units at launch, nor is it going to sell 20 to 25 million units at the end of its first fiscal year. The article is just stating that they're trying to make more Switch 2 units. Just like the article back in April was just saying that they were making 6 to 8 million Switch 2 units. None of this implies anything. This is just a fancy headline to say that they're making Switch 2s. And I don't know about you, but I assumed that Nintendo would be selling more than 20 million Switch 2s in the long term, regardless. And they'd probably hit that 20 million mark sometime in 2026. So obviously they're ramping up production, especially when you don't know what the state of the world is with different taxes and tariffs being brought up all the time and imports and exports being complicated. This is going to be the kind of article where right now, all it really does is help Nintendo's shareholder value increase, which is exactly what happened as soon as this article dropped initially. And it was the same thing that happened back in April when Nintendo's stock was not doing all that well and they needed to up the number a little bit prior to their next shareholder meeting. And then now what's going to happen is at the end of the year, when it doesn't hit that 20 to 25 million mark, people are going to be like, well, that's not what the article said. They just said they were producing more. And everyone's going to backtrack and be like, nobody actually thought it was going to hit 20 to 25 million. That was just a Bloomberg article. It's the same story again that what happened with the 6 to 8 million before launch. The cool thing is that while the 6 to 8 million article got Nintendo to go on a rally and it just kept increasing in price for the shareholders, this time around, the article was released just as the shareholder value was about to drop at its lowest it's been since the Switch 2 launched, and it was well on its way to even dropping below what it was back in April. And as soon as the Bloomberg article dropped, it just popped back up and started going the other way. But for now at least, it didn't really take it back to the same heights as the Bloomberg article back in April did. I just think it's kind of funny that people don't realize that these headlines and these articles are literally just out there as ways for these giant corporations with a lot of power to manipulate the stock market and please their shareholders, and nothing more. And this same person, Takashi Mochizuki, he will no doubt have another article come out later on this year talking about how the Switch 2 is underperforming because it didn't hit that marker of 20 million that this article is stating it will. And at that point in time, Nintendo fans will once again look back and be like, he's not really trustworthy. He's just looking for rage bait so he can get some clicks. All right, next on the list. Circana shared their September numbers today. This is the first month since the Switch 2 came out where we don't get an actual number or a rough estimate of where the Switch 2 currently sits. Now, obviously, it's because September was not a good month for the Switch 2. The best thing we got was that it did slightly worse than what it did back in August. And slightly less could mean a number of things. I'm guessing this thing currently sits between 2.6, maybe up to 2.65, because I think if it had hit 2.7, they definitely would have talked about it. 2.7 million would have meant that it sold 300,000. It would have been either equal to what was done in August or slightly more than that. And most importantly, they still could have done the same headlines where they're like, oh, it's trending 75 to 77% ahead of the Switch 1. But I think naturally it didn't get up there. I don't even think it hit 2.65 million because that probably would have been enough too. You could easily spin the headlines however you like at that point. Where it currently sits kind of hints that it probably sold less than 250,000 this month. Which, to keep in mind, this is a 5-week month, whereas the previous month was a 4-week month. So not only did it drop off pretty bad, it dropped off pretty bad with an extra week. Now, obviously, even if they hit that low number, it would still be the fastest selling console in the United States. But then people might start drawing parallels. This is the 4th month of the Switch 2's life. Let's say, optimistically speaking, it hit 250,000 this month. We all know, as of September, there were absolutely zero supply constraints. And then if you look at the original Switch's 4th month, it hit 216,000. It's pretty close, and this is when it was supply constrained in June, which is usually slower. So it no longer looks as impressive when you line them up month over month. Alternatively, you could also jump forward straight to September for the Switch 1's life. By the time the Switch 1 hit September, it was at 2 million, and the Switch 2 going into September was at 2.4 million, so it's fairly comparable. Lining up September of 2017 for the original Switch, and with the Switch 2, the Switch actually had a better September, 310,000. And in 2017, looking at the calendar, it looks like it was probably a 4-week month, not a 5-week month. So if you're looking at it from the angle of an investor from a fiscal year, they'll be like, how come the Switch 1 in September did better than the Switch 2 in September when that Switch 1 was supply constrained in September of 2017 and the Switch 2 is readily available? And they were both at fairly equal amounts sold. So that's obviously all the more reason for them to not share the number that was sold in September. And mind you, September is usually a pretty good performing month. The PS5 managed 420,000 in its first September, and the Xbox Series consoles managed 250,000, both of which were still supply constrained. Whereas the Switch 2, again, was fully available, and it basically might have tied the Xbox Series numbers. The point is, I think it's clear to say that Nintendo did not have a good September by their own standards, because if they did, that number would have been shared by their client, Circana. And honestly, anybody that's been tracking the sales numbers, looking at the retail charts, I think it was pretty obvious just how much of a drop-off the Switch 2 would have. Now mind you, the headline still has to be positive. So the headline reads that the Switch 2 outsold the PS5 in September. So we're already 4 months into this console's life, and we're at the point where we have to compare a 5-year-old console's September to a brand new console that is still supposed to be in peak launch demand. And that gives people a chance to celebrate and wave their flag because the Switch 2 is doing great, they think. Now, there are a lot of obvious reasons as to why September was very poor for the Switch 2, and I'll get to those shortly. Most of them are reasons of third-party and a lack of games. But the neat thing is, right now, looking at how Pokemon is trending, it's very similar to what was going on with Galaxy 1 and 2. It's showing that it's a game that's still gonna be one of the best-selling games of the year, but it's also performing much weaker than pretty much every other Pokemon game on the Switch 1. And while it is bumping up the Switch 2 units a little bit, it's not really bumping it up to the point where it feels like a massive system seller. Like, it seems like a lot of these numbers are coming from people that either already had the Switch 2, so they're buying Pokemon, or they're like, I'm not paying $500 for this Pokemon game, I'm gonna buy it on the Switch 1. But once again, I'm kind of pushing my limits a little bit here. Let me wait until there's more concrete data, and then we can have like one video dedicated to how well or unwell Pokemon is doing. But the point is that I don't know if October will be like that bomb month moving Switch 2 units that you would expect with the launch of a new Pokemon game on a brand new console. We'll see though. Either way, we know September was bad, like really slow. And usually, Septembers are pretty good, especially for software sales. Throughout the entire summer, we kept talking about how the Switch 2 was like tripping over here or messing up over there or not selling well in this or this game is not selling or whatever. And every time we talked about that, everybody's just like, it's the summer months. This guy thinks the Switch 2's failing because it didn't sell as well as the PS5 did in November. And yet now we're talking about September, which is usually a pretty good selling month. And right now it looks like it's the worst selling September for any new console in over a decade. And this is a prime example of launch demand being pulled forward. So those September sales that would have come for a regular console in September got pulled forward because of available stock. And likewise, that's going to happen with the October, but it's going to be offset by the Pokemon sales. And then in the holidays, well, this is why I don't think it's going to sell as well as the Switch 1 did, but we'll see. My assumption is those first-year holiday sales probably got pulled up a bit due to the stock availability. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that people are buying their Christmas gifts in July or August. It means normally that first-year holiday, it's a combination of people Christmas shopping, but more so, it's the early adopter enthusiasts. So now that you're moving all of the early adopter enthusiasts, all we're going to see remaining for the Christmas holiday are the people that want to buy this thing as a gift for their kids, and right now it's a very expensive gift. So we'll see. Now, of course, this could all be offset with a price drop, and that's what already happened in France. It's happened in various countries all around the world, specifically in Latin America, Asia, various pockets around Europe. And you might think those are just small markets. Why are you so hyper-focused on those? And it's because that other tab that we see in the financials that's doing much better this time around, those are sales from those regions, and usually they're not this high. So we do have to keep an eye on them. But even if you want to look at primary markets, a couple days ago, the Switch 2 had a major discount on Amazon in the United Kingdom. The The UK is not nearly as competitive as France is when their prices were going on, and when France had the price drop, everybody's like, it's normal, it's France, even though there are no historical indications that the PS5 price drop in France, especially this quickly after launch. And I'm not talking about longevity, about how many units were sold. I'm talking about this quickly after launch from the volume that has been sold. And likewise, same thing's happening with the United Kingdom. And we already know that the people in Spain are not really interested in the Switch 2 anymore, so this seems to be a trend. The big question is going to be whether or not the Switch 2 gets a Black Friday deal in the United States. Because I have like a tiny feeling that it might. It probably won't be anything drastic. It might be like an extra bundled game or something. But it'll be just enough where you and I will know why they're doing it. It's because there is ample stock and nobody wants to buy the Switch 2 anymore. Whereas it'll allow Switch 2 fans to be like, I don't know why you're acting like a deal on the first year only months after launch is indicative that it's not selling well. We all know why it gets a deal if it gets a deal. Even if it's a deal strictly made by the retailers and it's not officially announced by Nintendo, we'll know why they feel the need to add something extra to spice up the launch of this console. Now, next up, this is just to provide some context that things can be selling well. Since every time I talk about a drop in sales numbers, everybody's like, whoa, what do you mean? This is not COVID anymore. Why would you expect those kinds of numbers? Ghost of Yotei is matching Ghosts of Tsushima. Like it's selling as well as that game did. I'll take the words right out of Matt Piscatella's Twitter, or Blue Sky, whatever he uses. Ghost of Tsushima launched in July 2020. If you'll recall, stuff was happening at the time that significantly boosted gaming. And the PS4 install base at the time was significantly higher than the PS5 is today. Anyone with concern about this title should be looked at with a side eye. And it's important to note that this game costs $70, whereas that one costs $60. So yes, Ghosts of Yotei is doing great. The fact that we're not in COVID numbers anymore doesn't mean that consoles and games will not sell. People are still hungry to buy things. And most importantly, the fan base itself will buy it if it thinks it's worth the value. And Sony fans are used to spending a lot of money. Nintendo fans aren't. And this is also probably a good practice to remind people to stop focusing so highly on physical sales numbers for PlayStation games specifically. Well, PlayStation and Xbox, obviously. Physical sales charts, like Famitsu in Japan, for example, will favorably show Nintendo games doing better than Sony games because they don't account for the fact that Sony is like 20 to 30% physical, which means the true sales number of a Sony title on average is like 2, 3, or 4 times whatever the physical number we see is. Whereas Nintendo is the opposite. The majority of their sales are physical. It's closer to 70% if you look at the financials of Nintendo over the course of the past 5 years. Might even be 80%. So at best, you might be multiplying that physical Nintendo number by like 1.3. Even if you're being optimistic and saying 1.5, that's not gonna make a difference. And that's what you see whenever these charts come out. Last month, when Donkey Kong Bonanza was ranked in 3rd, everybody started asking Matt Piscatella if that was including digital sales data or not. And he was like, digital sales data will not make a difference on this ranking. When the UK numbers for Pokemon came in a few days ago, and we saw that there was a 40% drop over there compared to Legends Arceus, the first thing Nintendo fans asked was that if this included the digital sales numbers. And right away he was like, I doubt this makes a difference. And it's because Nintendo fans are conditioned to think that the digital multiplier is so much higher because that's what the majority of the industry does, but that's not what happens with Nintendo. The digital sales are more or less negligible when it comes to Nintendo consoles. Like, it's not really negligible. You're multiplying it by like 1.25 to 1.5, but on the Sony and the Xbox consoles, everything else, you're multiplying it by like 3 or 4 times. And it's very important to think about because it's a massive reason why we, and I say we as Nintendo fans, have always looked at the Switch as being the best-selling console with the highest-selling games, and we think that it makes the most money, whereas in actuality, a PlayStation 5 that seemingly has not sold as well, has not sold as many games, has been doing significantly better financially than Nintendo has, even though the Switch outsold the PS4 and the PS5. And actually, this might be a whole separate video on its own later. I think that point specifically is why we've seen such a big change towards the Switch 2 versus previous consoles. Nintendo realized that Sony was not releasing games, they were pushing everything towards digital, they were doing their best to court as many third parties as they can on their console by giving it a little bit more power, and somehow Sony managed to do better with the PS5 financially than they did with the PS4. And I genuinely believe that's a big indicator as to why Nintendo was behaving that it was. I think it's trying to be like Sony, but the problem is most Nintendo fans are not like Sony fans. And I don't mean that as an insult, I just mean gaming culture-wise, we're very different. But I'm gonna save that for another video. That's a a good topic for later. Now, obviously, Nintendo has tried as much as they can through all of September specifically, but most of the first few months of the Switch 2's life, to give third-party titles as much of a chance as they can to flourish. And they did this by basically not releasing anything to Nintendo fans for the first 3 months of the console's life. It's a bold move. Let's see if it paid off. Basically, by them not releasing any games, it allowed the charts to show that third parties were doing better than they were. But every time you saw how well third parties were doing on like all platforms mixed together, unless it was an older game or a technically weaker game, it usually wasn't doing that well on the Nintendo platforms, and even then it was doing good for the Switch 1 obviously, because it has a larger user base. So for example, in August, Madden ranked as the second best game in the Nintendo sphere, but if you look at how all of the other Nintendo titles ranked, you can see that it was a very small, basically irrelevant fraction of what was sold in the totality of the Madden games, and it's basically negligible at that point. If you're really interested in that, you can see the video that I released a few weeks ago about it. Now, going into this month, which is September, obviously, we can see the same pattern happening again. So first of all, topping the chart for Nintendo naturally is Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. Out of the entire list of games that were actually sold, this was number 14. Now, keep in mind a couple things. This only covers like the first 2 or 3 days of this game's launch, because it was like up till October 2nd, but this Circana data goes up to like the 4th of October or whatever. But also keep in mind that like 40 to 50% of these games sales usually happen on that first weekend. So it's not completely irrelevant, but just get the context in mind. This game released at the end of the tracking window. Immediately it goes to first place. But that's only first place for the Nintendo charts, because obviously there's nothing else that it really is competing with, because third-party games are not going to outdo any 3D Mario. And then when you look on the charts with all of the games combined, this Mario Galaxy mixture sits all the way down at number 14. And again, this is a Switch 1 title, right? Switch 1 and Switch 2. It has a biggest user base than any of these other games. It has the best user base that any 3D Mario game has ever launched to, and it couldn't even crack the top 10. So it did well, but obviously not well enough by Mario standards. Some might even call it a failure. And with this like mediocre turnout that Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 has, it still tops the charts for Nintendo games sold over the month of September. So let's discuss exactly how poorly this third-party push for Nintendo was over these past few months. And we'll start doing that by praising one of the third-party games. Final Fantasy Tactics actually did fairly well. And it's key because this is the type of third-party game that actually would perform well on a Nintendo console. It's a weak remake of an old game. Doesn't mean it's a bad game, but this is like, what, a PS1 title? These are the kind of third-party games that could flourish on the Switch. Now, that being said, the combined sales of Final Fantasy Tactics sits like 5 spaces above Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 on the combined chart. And since Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 is the best-selling game from Nintendo, you can kind of assume here that Final Fantasy Tactics sold better elsewhere than it did on the Switch. Or at the very least, the Switch is just like a piece of the pie here. Because like in third place, you have Donkey Kong Bonanza, which sits all the way down at number 18 for the best-selling games of the month. So we know the Switch 2 version of Final Fantasy sits between 14 and 18, so it's down there. And again, I'm not highlighting this to say that it did bad. I think it probably sold fairly well as it should on the Nintendo platforms, but not necessarily enough to ease the concern of third-party developers. At best, it hits that like Octopath Traveler crowd, which is good enough for Square Enix, I'm assuming. But the reason I mentioned the other third-party developers is because there is a notable absence on this list, and that's obviously Star Wars Outlaws. I want you to take a moment and think about what was probably the most advertised game for the Nintendo Switch throughout the month of September. Actually, I think it was like August leading up to September, and then just that initial massive boom that it had, and it just all over the internet, everybody was talking about it. That was Ubisoft's marketing, and probably even part of it was Nintendo's marketing to a whole new level. Think about every single YouTuber that pushed Star Wars Outlaws, because they got a copy for free, obviously, and how much they just really wanted people to understand that this was going to be the game that proves what the Switch 2 can do, and foolishly, everybody started to eat it up and assume that, like, yeah, this is going to be the thing that moves the third-party games for the Switch 2. The amount of money Ubisoft must have spent to water that game down so much so that it runs on the Switch 2, and then advertise the hell out of it, all for it to not even make the top 10 for Nintendo games. Now, potentially, part of the reason why it doesn't make this list is because Ubisoft does not report their digital sales to Circana anymore, so you have to fully rely on physical sales for this game. But we've already established that Nintendo fans, for the most part, don't buy digital. And then if you want to take a little bit of a step further, there are other games on this list that don't include digital. Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, obviously. Donkey Kong Bonanza, obviously. Now those two games, you'd expect them to be around the top for Nintendo consoles. These are massive first-party titles. But then you go down and you see Super Mario Party Jamboree and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. The games that had Switch 2 editions. Switch 2 editions that were released the prior month and the month before that, so this is not even like their peak month with the launch of upgrade packs. And still, those games made the list. And I mean, I knew they were going to because I saw the numbers over the few months when I was tracking how poorly Outlaws was doing. And I think it's just a clear indication that AAA third-party titles are of no interest to the Nintendo fandom. It's obvious. And again, the reason Nintendo really wants to focus on those third-party titles is because that's what Sony does, and that's why they can sit down and not release any games and make a bunch of money off of these AAA third-party games that sell millions all around the world except on Nintendo consoles. But it's not going to happen for Nintendo. And you can see it here because the best-selling game of 2025 across every console, starting from January until now, was NBA 2K26, which came out at the end of August. That game came out at the end of August, and immediately it jumped up to first place in all games sold for August, but it didn't even chart for the Nintendo console. Going into the following month, NBA 2K26, once again, first place for PlayStation, second place for Xbox, sixth place on PC, and then all the way down to 10th place for the Nintendo consoles. And then you have something like Madden, which also sits on all three of those top 10 rankings, and is nowhere to be seen on the Nintendo ranking. These games are selling phenomenally all around the world on every single platform, but they are not selling well on Nintendo consoles. Because, and say it with me, Nintendo is a first-party device only. And it's nice that we've finally moved on and we're about to start getting a string of first-party games coming out, because maybe we could stop the little fake discussion that this is like a massive third-party machine. There'll be a few that might make a dent, like Final Fantasy Tactics, for example. But for the most part, it won't. Like, let me give you an example of a third-party title that might do well on Nintendo's console later on. Sonic Racing Crossworlds. It opens up at number 8 for combined sales. Kind of crazy that it was the third best-selling PC game. And on the Nintendo consoles, it sits at number 4. Now, Sonic is the type of game that would perform well on a Nintendo console, similar to something like Final Fantasy Tactics, for example. But once again, this does not imply that it would be one of the best-selling games on the console, just that it would sell well enough to keep Sega happy. And considering that this is strictly the Switch 1 version, with a Switch 2 game coming later, and also considering the fact that this has been the most expensive launch for a Sonic game, I think, ever, and it's a spin-off, and it's competing on a platform that has Mario Kart, and even more so, eventually Sonic games, they actually gain sales later on in their life because they go down in price. Their trends are a bit funky like that, they do better later on. This actually is a very good launch for a Sonic game, and any Sonic fan knows that this is probably the best you can expect for Sonic Racing Crossworlds. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that it beats Mario Kart, but nobody in their right mind said that it would be Mario Kart. We just said it would be really funny if it did. And beating Mario Kart doesn't necessarily only apply to sales numbers. One thing I know for certain is that Sonic fans are a lot more satisfied with Sonic Racing Crossworlds than Mario Kart fans are with Mario Kart World. And journalists feel the same way. And only one of these games actually got DLC, and we know when it's going to get more DLC too. So we don't have to sit in this constant state of dread wondering if it's going to be getting more DLC later on, even though Nintendo has no indications at all that it would provide any DLC for Mario Kart World. But yeah, just strictly looking at it from a launch perspective for a Sonic game, a spin-off Sonic game, the most expensive Sonic game, this is a very good launch for Sonic Racing Crossworlds. And again, just like Final Fantasy Tactics, these are games that have launched very well. And a big reason they've done as well as they have in this launch is because they are carried by other consoles as well as the Switch. But they're still not nearly ranked high enough on the Switch to really compete with any first-party title as being like one of the best-selling titles on the console. And I mean, nobody should expect them to. This is not Madden, this is not NBA, this is not Call of Duty. There's only specific type of third-party titles that really take the top spot on other consoles. And those third-party titles usually do not make it to Nintendo consoles, or if they do, they don't nearly sell as much as they would everywhere else. They usually end up making like 4 to 5% of the sales up at best. You can kind of see the similar patterns in the UK with EAFC, for example. Anyway, I hope I don't have to bring up third-party sales again for the Switch 2. There are some first-party games coming out. There's plenty of content now for the Nintendo YouTubers to talk about first-party stuff. We can stop pretending for a second that everybody didn't just buy this thing for Pokemon and Mario. Oh, actually, wait. In the midst of all of this discussion over the past few weeks, because we finally got some first-party games, nobody even mentioned Persona 3 Reloaded coming out on the Switch 2. It runs at an unstable 30 frames per second, if I'm not mistaken, and nobody cares. If this game had come out a month ago, it would have been talked about a lot, we would have had discussions about it, and Nintendo YouTubers would have gaslighted us into thinking that this was part of the reason why the Switch 2 was the best handheld device. But yeah, I'm glad we've moved on from that phase of the Switch 2's life cycle. And just to be clear, this is not a game keycard issue. This is a third-party issue. There are game keycard titles for the Switch 2 that perform, and they sell. And while I would assume that the game keycard does affect the percentage of people that actually buy these massive third-party games on the Switch 2, there are already so few people that actually buy these third-party games on the Switch 2 as opposed to buying it on a PC or an Xbox or a PlayStation, that really you're just knocking down that percentage from like 4% of the sales to like 3.5%. I've been saying it from the beginning, the game keycard is crappy, it's awful, it shouldn't be a thing, but it's not the reason why third-party sales will underperform on the Switch 2. They're going to underperform because it's a Nintendo console. The trends that we're seeing right now are consistent with what we saw with the Switch 1. You'll get third-party games, usually the weaker ones will be fun for people to pick up, the ones that are like more kiddie, or lack of a better phrase. Your indie games, for example, your very old ports. But the first-party games at the end of it all will make up at least half of all of the sales, and all of the big hitters, the top 100 lists, is gonna be drowning with first-party titles. And this is in contrast to what you would see on a PlayStation device. Yeah, anyway, moving on from there. This is a random tidbit, but the PlayStation 5 has officially surpassed the PlayStation 3 in lifetime sales. The PS Portal has like a 5% attachment rate, which is pretty good, I suppose, for something that just streams games. I don't know what's considered successful or unsuccessful for these things, but based off of the discourse online, it seems like this is a pretty good milestone. I guess when you consider how expensive it is and how it's just an accessory add-on for a more expensive console, that makes it a very favorable result. PS5 sales actually increased this month compared to the previous month, even though it got a price hike. I don't personally like that trend, but it goes to show that people will spend more on a PlayStation 5 because that's where they want to play their Maddens, and that's where they want to play their NBAs. And of course, Ghost of Yotei, you can't take away from that. A lot of people went out and bought a PlayStation 5 specifically to buy that game, and that's why it has an increase of sales from the previous month. Now, obviously, you're 5 years into the console's life, you don't expect like a massive increase, but to see the price go up and they still went out and buy it, that's impressive. But despite that, I hate that trend. I hate that these consoles can increase in price and then sell more. Now, granted, it's not all doom and gloom for Nintendo. Today, there was a big trailer on the Nintendo YouTube page saying that Pikmin is getting an update. Many of you were very excited for this Pikmin update. Pikmin 4 with a resolution bump and a frame rate bump. You know, the reason we bought the Switch 2 is for these first-party games to be better. But unfortunately, this was not a Switch 2 bump. It was just like a regular update that added some camera mode or something. That stings. But then again, it's probably the buyer's fault for assuming that when they bought a console that would run their Switch 1 games better, that they expected that those games would be updated to run and look better on the new console. You know what? Instead of adding my own commentary to this, I'm just gonna steal a comment straight off of Reddit. The Switch 2 has been the biggest waste of money I've ever spent. If only they'd toggle the stupid dock mode in Switch 1 emulation software to allow 1080p on handheld. Would be great, considering I can do it in custom firmware. The Switch 2 buyer's remorse is very, very real.